is this the best way to fight climate change? This article came out in The Guardian. Want to help fight climate change? Have fewer children. Interesting, provocative article. So, the genesis of this idea is illustrated in this infographic that you're looking at right here. The infographic shows you basically all the different personal choices you can make to reduce your contribution to climate change, and it shows that basically recycling and hanging your clothes to dry or using cold water in your dryer, much smaller footprint than, say, for example, eating a plant-based diet, which we'll talk about in the future show. Diet habits, switching to electric car, which I drive a hybrid, looking forward to having a Tesla soon, I hope. But when they compare that to having one fewer child, basically the idea is that the emissions of your children become your emissions if you're a parent, and therefore the best thing you can do if you're concerned about climate change is to have less children. Now, of course, this is a debate that goes back to the 1970s, even the 60s, this idea that basically we just have too many people on this planet, and that is one of the biggest problems we have. Interesting to see that coming back into the debate in a pretty aggressive way with this article that was in The Guardian. What do you think about this? Well, this sparked quite a big conversation on Facebook. Like I said, Professor Sophie Harrison, wrote a personal post, which I'm not going to share with you because it was on her private personal page, but, I don't think she'd mind me mentioning the fact that she brought this up. I found it particularly interesting coming from her because her two kids, Sam and Sophie, are both climate activists. In fact, two of the founders of Kids for Climate Action, a great group, and they also have played a role in UBC 350, the University of British Columbia Community 350.org group, doing all kinds of important work to reduce greenhouse gases. So right away it kind of brings up this question of like, well, what if one of your kids is Sophie or Sam or David Suzuki or, somebody like that. Like, not every child is the same, but of course we're looking here at statistics, averages, and kind of a broader policy landscape. So I thought it was an interesting frame for a conversation. And a bunch of different people have been weighing in on this, both in the thread on Professor Harrison's wall, but I also posted the article for discussion on my personal Facebook page and let people know that I was going to be talking about it here today, so I hope you add your comments and your thoughts here. If you're watching this after the fact, by the way, and you're on our blog, please feel free to comment there as well. Interesting piece in response to that from a guy named David Roberts, who you may remember from the work that he's done at Grist. He now writes for Vox.com, one of my personal favorite publications. And he basically said that the best way to reduce your personal carbon emissions is actually to not be rich. Some lifestyle choices matter more than others, which is basically a response to this piece. And he highlights this infographic that comes to you from Oxfam. Great opportunity to give a shout out to Oxfam, one of the more important environmental organizations, but they also, they focus on poverty issues primarily, but they've been really looking at the impact of climate change, particularly on the poorest people in the world, and in particular women in less developed countries. And what they're highlighting here is that the richest 10% of people on the planet contribute about half of the greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. The poorest 50% of people on the planet are responsible for around 10% of total lifestyle emissions. So, long story short, it's not really just about whether you have children or not, but it's about how wealthy you and your children are that will really determine your level of greenhouse gases. To put this in another perspective, they looked at per capita lifestyle consumption emissions in G20 countries. So, if you're, of course, there's rich and poor people in every country, but if you look at, different countries and the per capita consumption emissions, so like the emissions that you personally are creating through your consumption choices, the US and Canada were at the top of the list, followed by Great Britain. Yada, yada, yada. Basically, the richest countries in the G20 produce the most emissions per capita. So, of course, if you look at emissions in China, there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, but if you look at it on a per capita basis, like in terms of the, the average person, the per capita emissions in the United States, Canada, much, much higher. Therefore, we have a much bigger responsibility. I didn't find a good slide for you to illustrate this, but an interesting point in the mix of this is that actually population is growing much faster in the poorest countries. and actually population is not growing nearly as fast, and in fact is even declining in some of the most developed countries, in some of the richest countries. So you could actually make an argument that there really is no direct correlation between the number of children on the planet and the amount of greenhouse gases. Now, of course, we would all like to see everybody's standard of living increased, raised, and if we did that, that would actually reduce the differentiation between the United States and China, say, for example. Like, let's say that every person in China had a footprint the size of those in the United States. Of course, their per capita emissions would be higher, assuming, of course, that they continue to produce energy, primarily from coal. It's also worth pointing out, of course, that China is the world leader in bringing on renewable energy. So this is a more complicated issue, I think, than just that simple analysis of the number of children and emissions. But it is definitely something worth talking about. And I think it actually brings up some bigger issues even than just whether a child generates emissions or whether you're responsible for them. But there are these broader issues that I think we need to look at. Which is a good segue to talking about this book, Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming, which was edited by none other than Paul Hawken, a great guy in terms of all the different work that he's put out into the world. Natural Capital, The Ecology of Commerce, some books that had a big influence on me, along with many other authors when I was a student, and continued to find quite interesting. He's looked at the role of nonprofit societies in his latest book. Somebody help me out here. I can't remember the name of his latest book. It's one of the problems with doing a live show. But Drawdown, this new book, is a very comprehensive study, and they look at a number of different things, not just energy, but all sorts of different policy choices, personal choices, and we've suggested the idea of doing a monthly book club, and this being our first book club. We posed the question to folks on our Facebook page earlier this week and had a number of responses from people saying that this is something they'd like to do. If you are interested, again, we'll post a link to where you can get this book, either as an ebook or in the print edition. And we would love to start having these conversations. My guess is probably by the end of August would be when we'd be able to do that, because again, Mari, Rosie, and I are in the midst of a cross-Canada tour, spending some time with family right now in Toronto. Soon we'll head out to PEI, and then we'll make our way back across the country, meeting with all kinds of different people, and checking out a lot of different projects, and going for runs and walks to raise money for an important renewable energy project. So, Drawdown, great book to take a look at. There was actually an interview that Dave Roberts did with Paul Hawken about this book, where they went explicitly into this issue of the number of children you have and how that relates to this conversation of sustainability. I thought that was a fascinating interview. I encourage you to check it out. But long story short, they basically make the conclusions that Dave made in his article with those infographics that I referenced, basically highlighting the fact that there was a lot more to this. And actually what Paul Hawkins and others suggest in this book is that actually educating women in less developed countries and providing adequate access to birth control is one of the more important things you can do, because the more educated people are, the more economic opportunities they have, which changes the likelihood that they're going to have larger numbers of children. And of course, access to birth control is useful in and of itself in a variety of ways. So that is an important thing to consider. What I really like about this book is that it does not just look at what we need to do, in terms of reducing greenhouse gases, just in terms of the kinds of energy that need to be produced, but also the likelihood of these different policy frameworks being adopted. They show 3 different scenarios and basically give you the amount of greenhouse gases that could be reduced through a variety of different approaches. Spoiler alert, one of the top things that they suggest is actually related to refrigeration of food, which I'll let you read the book and get a closer look at that. But the use of refrigerants and the way that we dispose of food has huge implications, but they also look at many other things that are very important. But for our conversation today, I thought it would be interesting also to draw on this article from the New York Times, which is kind of related to this conversation, which I just kind of brought up, which is this idea of what is the most likely thing to happen, what is the most feasible, most possible. And the New York Times article here is referencing the Solutions Project, the 100% Renewables Project, which I'm a big fan of. A professor from Stanford put together a comprehensive plan for the United States and also globally, which just shows how you could get to 100% renewables using existing technology, which I think is very important. Just to give you a little taste, this is, I just took a screenshot right off their website. You can go into a map, and again, we'll share all these links in the show notes. But, this just shows how Canada, using existing technology, could be 100% renewable, what the mix would look like using existing technology and existing potential for energy production. There's a lot to that New York Times article and the critique, going back and forth. Some argue that these fights are actually counterproductive because they make people feel like perhaps we can't move forward, because we're fighting amongst ourselves about some of the wonkier details. But I think it's important that we take a look at this kind of thing, and and frankly, most people are so far removed from that. I think just knowing that it's possible within existing technology to be well on our way towards 100% renewables is really, really important. But really what I want to get at is this idea of what our role as individuals is, and how we get to the kind of social license that's required to really move forward aggressively with the kinds of things we need to do to confront what has been called the greatest single threat facing humanity today. So it's really useful to have a sense of kind of what technologies are required, but what does it really look like getting from here to there? What are the concrete steps we can take starting today to get us to where we need to be tomorrow? You guys still with me? Sound good? Okay, cool. So this brings up the question, like I said, personal responsibility versus collective action. Just as a starting point, how did we end up in this place where we're focusing so heavily on personal responsibility? And I think it's an interesting point. Is really the number one thing you can do to have less children if you care about climate change? There is some very interesting work that's been done on this. I'll say one more thing about that issue before I move into the personal responsibility piece, which is, as a white man in a privileged position, in a rich country, I find it a little bit awkward, let's say, to be focusing so heavily on whether having children is the right thing to do or not. Anything that really gets into the area of a woman's right to choose, I find to be a troubling framework for a conversation. Whether we should be looking at things like a one-child policy in China, or whether it be telling women that they can't have an abortion or that they can't have a child. I think this is really an area that men need to be careful about how they weigh in on. Is it really our place to be even suggesting such things? I think that's a fraught landscape, to put it gently. So I think that needs to be said in the context of this conversation. Sophie Harrison, when she saw me talking about this, that's the daughter of Professor Catherine Harrison, who works for the Dogwood Initiative. High five for you, Sophie. Does all kinds of great work. She actually posted a link to an interesting article from a woman's perspective talking about these choices she's making in her own life, knowing that you live in a wealthy country. Obviously, there is impact to our personal choices, and it's important that we think about that. And many people do make that choice not to have children for a variety of different reasons. It's a very personal choice. But in a broader conversation about whether this is something that we should be advocating for, that we should be pushing for, I think that's a different kind of conversation. And I just wanted to get to one little interesting tidbit in our history that could tell us something about this conversation, which is, how did we get to a place where we focus so heavily on personal responsibility? Are you familiar with the commercial, the Crying Indian? It features this guy, his name's Cody, what's his name, Crying Eyes Cody, or Iron Eyes Cody, who, turns out, small aside, was actually not a Native American, he was Italian. He claimed for his entire life to be a Native American, was a strong advocate for Native American people, and this commercial is probably one of the most famous commercials ever. I know a lot of Indigenous people who kind of laugh at this commercial, make jokes about it, but I actually think there's some very significant pieces to it which are worth us taking a moment to reflect on. The commercial is about a minute long. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go to Google it right now and play it for you just so you can see it while we're talking. So just give me a sec while I do that. Opening up this thread here. There's my show notes. Let's see. Crying Indian commercial. Until I was Googling this earlier. So there we go. Full commercial. made by a group called Keep America Beautiful, and we'll talk about who they are momentarily. Let me get this commercial playing for you.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it.
So there you go. Keep America Beautiful, everyone. So I highlighted this piece in Orion magazine because I think it actually has an interesting take on the impact of this commercial and the history of this campaign. So of course it's worth pointing out that throwing garbage out your window is really stupid, and this campaign was actually quite successful in getting people to actually throw out garbage, which, believe it or not, was a big debate at the time. There was another campaign that was called Don't Mess with Texas, which I think is one of the more successful campaigns in changing behavior, really trying to get people to think about how they were messing with Texas if they, threw out their garbage on the side of the highway. But this was actually a very serious problem at the time. But it was actually tied to a bigger debate, which I'll share you. You'll forgive me, I usually hate slides with tons of text on them, but I think this one's important. It's worth pointing out, this is a direct quote from the Orion magazine piece, that as late as 1960, refillables still delivered 95% of the nation's soft drinks. The beer industry was moving from small local brewers to centrally located operations, and they started making disposable bottles. By the end of the 1950s, half the nation's beer would be in throwaway containers. Many of them were ending up on as roadside trash. In 1953, Vermont state legislature decided to try to ban the sale of beer in those disposable bottles. And it declared that beer could only be sold in reusable bottles. A glass manufacturer filed suit, calling it unconstitutional, went to the Vermont Supreme Court. And then the Keep America Beautiful campaign was actually born in October, declaring its intention to break Americans from the habit of tossing their litter into the street and out of car windows. But the New York Times noted that the group's leaders included executives of concerned manufacturers, beer cans, bottles, soft drinks, chewing gum, etc., etc. These were the disciples of disposability, led by William Stoke, president of the American Can Company, and they set about changing the terms of the conversation about litter. I think this is fascinating. Basically what we're seeing happen in that moment is a move away from a focus on the responsibility of the producer and a move to focus on the responsibility of the individual. Some would suggest that this was actually a deliberate attempt by some very sophisticated companies working as part of a conglomerate to actually shift the debate. You could suggest that this was just a totally benign thing, and that it was very good that people were being encouraged to not throw out garbage out of their car window, or basically just to not, this is even pre-recycling being a focus, although Keep America Beautiful became a major proponent of recycling in the time soon after that, which continued to keep the focus on individual responsibility. I think it's an interesting moment. Whether this was some sort of conspiratorial ploy to shift our focus, or just smart advertising, or just kind of the nature of how things work. I think there is this question about whether we could have done better by actually legislating that things should be sold in a particular way, that would have made it much less wasteful and generated a lot less harm in the long run, or whether the responsibility ultimately comes to us. But it is worth pointing out that the choice to switch to non-reusable bottles, like to switch away from glass bottling, was not one that was made by consumers because they were demanding a different kind of packaging. It was one that was made by industry, and there was a big push at the time to shift the focus. And clearly, this organization, Keep America Beautiful, had a very clear intent to change the debate somewhat. So, interesting tidbit of the conversation. Anyway, I thought I'd throw it in the mix as we were talking about this broader conversation around personal responsibility in the context of whether and not having children was the way to go. An interesting turning point moment. Also, just amazing to know that this guy here, who was kind of a famous face of Indigenous people, was actually an Italian guy. There's so much more to unpack about that. Talking about the way that we characterize Indigenous people and put them into this very, very stereotypical box, and the role that the advertising agencies and media has played in that over the years. It's a much bigger topic than I'm going to cover right at this moment, but I couldn't show you that without at least recognizing the fact that there's a lot to talk about there that should be unpacked, and I'll definitely get into issues like that in a future episode of the show. But please, if you have anything to say about that or articles you want to share, please do that as well. Just wanted to share one other interesting piece with you, which is this film, The Century of the Self, which looks at the guy you're looking at the screen right now. This is I just took a screenshot directly from the YouTube video. This is a guy named Edward Bernays, who's Sigmund Freud's nephew, who was one of the fathers of what we now think of as public relations, the modern public relations industry. He was actually the founder of the first Institute for Public Relations, and was involved in many different efforts. I'm not sure if he was directly involved in this particular effort, but you can definitely look at public relations history and its tie-ins to psychology, and connected to this guy. Was responsible for many different campaigns, and starting with actually selling the war effort during the Second World War, and then got to work for many different American corporations trying to change people's attitudes and behavior, and definitely was part of a shift towards a focus on the self, which is why this documentary is called The Century of the Self. It's 3 parts. I think it was originally made for the BBC, if I'm not mistaken. You can actually watch the entire thing on YouTube, and again, we'll post the link to that if you're interested. It's a bit of an aside from this focus on climate change, but I think, if we are taking this bigger picture look at sort of personal responsibility versus collective action, this is an interesting documentary to check out if you haven't already. The interesting thing about Bernays was he used a lot of Sigmund Freud's ideas, and actually got the idea for focus groups from group therapy sessions that Freud was one of the first people to do. And he looked at really base human motivations as ways to influence people in advertising, and arguably has been quite successful in shaping a lot of things about our modern society. You could suggest that those were really just underlying drives within human beings, and that his role was really minor, but I do think there's something to be said for looking at this history. I think it's interesting. So yeah, do check that out. Edward Bernays, interesting guy. In particular, I think you'd find it fascinating to see the work that he did to try to convince women to become smokers. It was not considered a socially acceptable thing, with his Torches of Freedom campaign, which basically involved a public relations stunt where a bunch of suffragettes marched in a 4th of July parade and then lit up cigarettes in front of the Statue of Liberty, declaring that they were torches of freedom. And this was a form of women's liberation, was to show that women could do anything that men could do, and that included smoking cigarettes. That campaign went all over North America and around the world. And believe it or not, actually, almost overnight had huge changes in terms of the number of women who smoke cigarettes. You can see the whole story of that in this documentary. I forget whether it's the first, second, or third episode of the documentary. But long story short, a fascinating thing to check out, and you can watch it for free on YouTube.